of the British Association for Romantic Studies digital events series. The aim of the series is to foster a sense of community and conviviality within our field during these difficult and isolating times. And we're glad to gather together students and scholars across disciplines to discuss new perspectives, digital approaches, anniversaries, and celebrations of romantic writers. The BAR's digital events series has been organized with the support of the executive by the Digital Events Committee. I'm Amanda Blake Davis, a postgraduate representative for BARS, and I serve on the committee alongside my fellow postgraduate representative Colette Davis, our fantastic digital events fellow Francesca Caloran, the head of the committee and the BAR's communications officer Anna Mercer, and our brilliant BAR's website editor Matthew Sangster. If this is your first time attending a BAR's digital event, welcome, and please do look out for future events on the BAR's blog and on our social media channels. We have a very exciting lineup of events that have been contributed to the series by BAR's members, which will run through to July, and which speak to the needs and concerns of those working within romantic studies right now. From events on eco-criticism, transgender and non-binary romanticism, and Black studies to many more events that re-envision the field. If you are a BAR's digital event regular, welcome back, and we're so glad to see you again. This event will follow the same format as our previous events, being a roundtable discussion between 5 leading scholars followed by a Q&A with the audience. And a reminder that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Just a bit of quick Zoom housekeeping before we get started then. So we kindly ask that audience members keep video and audio turned off during this session, as this will minimize disruptions and hopefully keep our connection running smoothly. You're very welcome and encouraged to use the text chat box to converse with other attendees during this session. And should you have any technical difficulties at all, please use the chat box to alert the digital events team, who are on standby to assist our speakers and audience throughout this session. We will be having a Q&A session after all of our speakers have presented, so please hold your questions until the end of the event, or type the letter Q and your question into the chat box at any point during the event. Then we'll pick up your question at the end. At the end of the event, I'll call on audience members to ask their questions, and at this point, I'll welcome you to turn on your audio and video. This event will finish at 6:30 p.m., but you're very welcome to stay around afterwards for a chat. So, the topic of this evening's event is the Late Mary Shelley, belatedly marking the anniversary of Mary Shelley's death on February 1st, 1851, and drawing attention to Shelley's later or post-Frankenstein achievements. I'd like to thank the Digital Events Committee for helping to organize and promote this session, and particularly Anna Mercer for her guidance and Matt Sangster for his suggestion of this event's title, belatedly commemorating the late Mary Shelley by attending to her later works. 2018 was a remarkable year for Shelley scholars, students, and fans, and we enjoyed seeing everything from Frankenstein firework displays to commemorative coins to marathon readings of the novel and so much more. But Shelley was, of course, not a one-hit wonder, and we wanted to take this opportunity to celebrate her many achievements as a prolific novelist, an extraordinary editor, a life and travel writer, and as a figure of persisting influence upon our modern lives. Around this time last year, between baking banana bread and running laps around our bedrooms, so many of us found ourselves picking up Shelley's novel of global pandemic, The Last Man, and as with Frankenstein, again being struck by the text's startling relevance. We've recently received news that there will be a forthcoming Norton critical edition of The Last Man, edited by Chris Washington, that will consider the novel in terms of its contemporary relevance. And this evening, we'll hear about The Last Man's engagement with social issues of Shelley's time and of our own, the future, as well as Matilda, Valperga, Shelley's editing of her husband's poetic compositions, her role as a mediator of European culture, her relationship with the Gothic, and more. We're in the great company of Dr. Antonella Braida, Kathleen Hurlock, Professor Michael Rossington, Professor Angela Wright, and Carly Yingst this evening. And it's an honor to welcome such a brilliant lineup of Shelley scholars to speak with us here. Without any further ado, we'll begin. So Antonella, if you'd like to turn on your audio and video, and I will introduce you, please.
Okay. Is the sound all right?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. So Dr. Antonella Braida is lecturer in English at the Department of Computer Studies at the Université de Lorraine and member of the Research Center IDEA Interdisciplinarity in English Studies. Her publications include a monograph, Dante and the Romantics, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2004, and an edited collection, Mary Shelley in Europe, Essays in Honor of Jean de Palacio, published by Legenda just last year, 2020. In 2016, she organized a symposium on Mary Shelley's works and their European reception, and she is currently working on a volume of the representation of Italy by women writers in the 1820s. Antonella will start her presentation today from her new collaborative volume, Mary Shelley in Europe, and will be speaking on Mary Shelley in and Europe. She will focus on de Palazio's contribution to the reception of the inclusive Mary Shelley and on her role as a mediator for European and in particular for Italian culture. I hand over to you now, Antonella.
Okay, let me share my screen first. Okay, and sorry, it's not yet perfect there. Okay, right. Can you see my screen now? Is that okay? Right, so I'm extremely honored to be invited to this vast digital seminar, and I have to thank Amanda and the team for organizing this great event. So as Amanda said, I've recently concluded a long-term project that resulted in the volume Mary Shelley in Europe. And it started with a conference 2016 and then a workshop with Mary Shelley scholar Jean de Palacio. For both events, I had the generous collaboration and advice of Michael Rossington and Nora Crook. So I'm going to rely on the incredible work undertaken by the contributors to the volume, and I have to take this opportunity to thank them together with the editors and copy editors of the Legenda series. So as Amanda said, I think these 4 years have been extremely fruitful for Mary Shelley scholarship, and I'll just try to put here together some of the events that took place, but I'm sure they are not exhaustive in 2018 and more recently. And I think, however, despite all these great events, the issue of approaching the inclusive Mary Shelley, as Nora Crook phrases it, is still relevant, especially as far as the late Mary Shelley is concerned. And my focus today is going to be on Mary Shelley's role as a cultural mediator for Italy, and in particular through her non-fiction writing. This production, of course, as we know, comprises, as in reviews, there are travel writings, rambles, and the literary biographies, but I would like to put the reviews and essays center stage. This body of writing is still left in an uncertain canon. Nora Crook gave an assessment of the status quo in the essay she published in the volume, and she insisted on the need for further research, especially in trying to identify article. I think that thanks to Nora's effort and continued by Lisa Vargo, Pamela Clement, and one should mention, of course, before them, the Palacios and Robinson's work, we're beginning to see Mary Shelley, the prose writer, emerge alongside the novelist, travel writer, and biographer. This aspect is relevant for me because I've been working on the review articles of Mary Margaret Basque, a lesser-known contributor who authored more than 100 review articles for Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, the Athenaeum, and Foreign Quarterly Review. What I would like to point out is that Mary Shelley was a member of a tiny but very active group of women contributors who were becoming extremely professional. And indeed, I'm interested in the way Mary Shelley and these women were shaping their public figure as contributors. Other contributors were Lady Morgan, Sarah Austin, for example, and I'm interested, of course, on women contributors who were writing about Italy. And certainly they paved the way for women in the Victorian period with the key figure of Harriet Martineau. So what was Mary Shelley's contribution to essay writing, and how should her prose writing be approached? At present, we can count more than 10 confirmed reviews and articles and essays. And they were written mostly after her return to Britain, in the pauses among her work on the novels, on the literary lives. They mostly predate Rambles. And their content and style reflects themes that she was writing about in her fiction and non-fiction writing. I would like to limit myself to 3 considerations as a tentative assessment, and there will be a topic for discussion. I'll try to sort of be careful about the time. So here I've listed some of the articles and essays. Well, first point, Mary Shelley's essays and reviews, like those of the women reviewers I mentioned, and Basque in particular, whose work is well documented, reveal her role as a cultural mediator for Italy simply by choosing the topics for publication, as shown by the letter she wrote to the editors. Here I've given some examples of her correspondence. So they show her effort to suggest topics that could be deemed original, interesting, close to themes she felt strongly about. And I could add that being accepted or rejected seems also to have depended on the ability to establish a close relationship with the editor. This was true for Basque with William Blackwood, and for Mary Shelley with the editors of the Westminster Review. And in fact, at some point she was rejected after the disagreement over the article De Bravo. I think that, as Mary Favre pointed out, this ability to act as a cultural mediator helped her prepare for the edition of Percy's poetical works, for which she had to combine the roles of editor, transcriber, critic, and biographer. And my second point, to which I will hint at in passing, is that his role as in this role as cultural mediator, Italy figures prominently among her interests. And indeed, she embraced Italianness or Italianism, as De Palacio quoted it, or Maria Schina, as a way of creating her public identity as a writer. So she adopted a hyphenated identity. We can just mention her signature, the signature Anglo-Italian, but I would like to mention also that twice she signed as Maria and Marina, and this Marina is not being pointed out because then in the Bennett's letter it was translated as Mary. Right, so this sort of bicultural identity for Mary, I think, was important, and she pointed it out in the article De Bravo. She claimed that Mr. Cooper has not Italianized himself and did not try to learn the language. My third point, and then I'll try to mention a fourth if I've got the time, concerns Mary Shelley's effort to adopt the style and structure required by the magazine she contributed to. For example, by comparison with these other women reviewers I mentioned, and Basque in particular, Shelley was really interested in the genre of the essay, and she was aware of her best achievement. For example, she was very proud of the English in Italy, and she mentioned it to Murray when she wanted to become a contributor of the quarterly review. And for example, among the essays, I think that both Giovanni Villani, her contribution to the Libero, and the English in Italy reveal her mastery of the art of the essay. And I quote here Timothy Morton: "Each essay is replete with balanced prose of vigor and gravity that searches for the deeper implications of her topics." I think that both essays seem to me in line with the style and structure of the familiar essay as had been defined by Hazlitt in Table Talk, or his essay on familiar style, and also Lamb's essays, Elias' essays for the London Magazine. Indeed, Mary Shelley herself identifies directly her model in a footnote in which she mentions the papers of Elia, and she says as the most beautiful and highly valued specimens of the kind of writing spoken in the text. It is a style that works by accumulation of ideas which are coordinated, and they work through long digressions, and there's this beautiful section in Giovanni Villani, but perhaps I'll try to go quickly, not to take too much time from my contributors. But I think that I would like to use here David Russell's use of the phrase, the sociability of the transitional, in the sense that this essay, as he says for Lamb, they become a kind of inverted closet drama, and the play is found to be in the street. So here, Mary Shelley mentions a visitor who finds themselves in the middle of a contemporary theatrical performance, and she compares this as the intrusions of the author in the text. And this idea of the transitional, I think, is present even in the style used by Mary Shelley. The language itself becomes a transitional object, neither subjective nor objective, but rather creative. For example, here, in these examples I've chosen, we've got this use of this we that is neither impersonal nor personal, or one, and it is a way of putting sort of the autobiographical experience into the essay, but in a very kind of a vague way. And this brings me to my third and last point, and I really apologize for rushing, but I really want to respect the time. So I would like to conclude by saying that when writing for the Liberal and the Westminster Review, Mary Shelley adhered to the editor's support of the liberal cause and the continental revolutions. And indeed, Lisa Vargo has pointed out the way in which Mary Shelley adopted a formal liberal authority in these essays. And moreover, I think Mary Shelley adopts the agenda of the Westminster Review by focusing on literature that promotes political reform. And this is shown also in her two long articles, Modern Italian Romances, in which she reviewed contemporary Italian historical novels that aimed at its inciting patriotic feelings. A project that had been advocated by Mazzini and put into practice, especially by the Italian novelist Francesco Guerrazzi, reviewed by Mary Shelley. And I'm going to conclude with this last point. And I think also in this review essay this review essay show that Mary Shelley was particularly interested in translation as a cultural mediation. And this again was in line with the demands by the reviews that were using European literatures as a means of expressing their literary and political stance. And I think that both Mary Shelley and the women reviewers of the 1830s were really able to write about Italy at a time in which interest in the country was very strong, as it has been pointed out recently, for example, by Will Bowers in The Italian Idea. So both wrote about historical novels that had become the expression of the political radicalism in the post-1820s Italian revolts. And I'll conclude just by saying that both also were extremely sensitive to women's cultural role in both Italy and Britain. Thank you.
Antonella, thank you so much for that. And to our audience, you can use the reaction button to show your applause, because I know we can't applaud as we usually would. Thank you so much for that incredibly rich talk. Fascinating to think about Mary Shelley as a mediator in so many ways, a mediator of Italian identity, mediator of prose, and a mediator of Percy Shelley. I loved how you said that this experience of mediating Italian culture prepared her to mediate Percy's works. Absolutely a fantastic talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And again, I can see some questions coming into the chat. And just a reminder, we'll take those at the end of the session after all of our presenters have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to our next speaker, Kathleen. Kathleen, yep, you're on the screen, great. So Kathleen Hurlock is a PhD student in English at the University of Georgia with research interests in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and a specialization in depictions of trauma and recovery in British women's fiction from the late 18th century to the 19th century. She completed her MA dissertation on Mary Shelley's Matilda, and she has written on Matilda for the Keats Shelley Association of America's blog in 2019. Kathleen's forthcoming publications include entries on the matrix of intelligibility and psychoanalytic theory in the Encyclopedia of Queer Studies in Education, coming out with Brill and Sense, and an essay on the victim of prejudice in an edited collection about romantic women writers and sexuality. Kathleen will be speaking to us today on motherhood as systemic violence in the later Mary Shelley, addressing how Matilda and the Last Man offer depictions of motherhood that suggest how mothering and the requirement to be a mother on the 19th century woman both literally and figuratively kill women, either truly ending their lives through maternal death or otherwise preventing their living to the fullest extent. She will argue that both novels posit these deaths as a kind of systemic elimination of women, one in which they are unable to engage in bonds with other women that potentially help to form a type of feminist resistance against this kind of motherhood. Kathleen, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good. I don't have a slide. I'm just gonna read off my paper. So like Amanda said, I'm gonna be reading about the later Mary Shelley and maternity today. So since second wave feminist literary critics first took up Mary Shelley as a concern in the mid-20th century, scholarly work regarding her relationship to maternity and pregnancy, particularly with regard to Frankenstein, has reigned. Early feminist critics take up that novel as an allegory for the horrors of pregnancy and childbearing. Today, I want to continue the tradition of reading maternity critically in Shelley by considering how, in later texts, namely Matilda and the Last Man, as Amanda mentioned, Shelley offers much more explicit and, at times, harsh thoughts on the imperative for women to mother through not allegory, but actual maternal characters who ultimately end up suffering directly due to their maternity. Unlike the early feminist readings, which tend toward inherently coupling the events of Frankenstein with Shelley's own experiences regarding pregnancy, maternity, and illegitimacy, these two later novels, especially Matilda, tend toward having clear textual evidence of a critical approach to maternity and to pregnancy. In fact, Matilda is interesting because of how a dead mother, Matilda's own mother Diana, is simultaneously invisible and hyper-present in the text. Shelley kills off Diana, so to speak, very early in the book and without a lot of fanfare. The quote, and this is Matilda speaking, 15 months after their marriage, I was born, and my mother died a few days after my birth. No further explanation is given. Diana, forever gone from Matilda's life after this implied childbirth-related death, appears very little after this moment in the text, only surfacing as a character in the love story with Matilda's father. Yet, it is Diana's absence that causes the events of the story, leading to Matilda's unnamed father abandoning her, their years later meeting, and his expression of incestuous desire towards her. Still, even once Matilda's relationship with her father crumbles, Matilda rarely acknowledges Diana, pushing her aside for a feudal relationship with her father. She says, quote, I clung to the memory of my parents, my mother I should never see. She was dead, but the idea of my unhappy wandering father was the idol of my imagination. If Matilda is so ready to dismiss Diana as dead and unknowable, why would Shelley even include her as a named character in the text? I believe that, I believe that the answer to this question lies in an odd parallel we can see early in the novel. Namely, just as Victor Frankenstein's strange supernatural experiences can parallel the everyday anxieties of pregnancy and early maternity, Matilda's brush with verbal, but never acted upon, incestuous desire actually parallels what seems to be Diana's rather ordinary experiences with courtship, marriage, pregnancy, and ultimately death. Shelley actually draws two parallels that highlight the unfairness of what happens to Diana. First, she subtly compares what happens to Matilda to the fate of a survivor of a more literal rape. Again, what happens to Matilda is odd in terms of an early 19th century novel. She's no Clarissa Harlow. She never experiences anything akin to a literal rape, even by today's standards. Matilda's experiences might be best classified as emotional or sexual abuse in today's terms, and Shelley, writing in Matilda, treats those experiences as legitimately traumatic through metaphor. For example, upon hearing her father's revelation, Matilda reacts in a manner that recalls a physical violation. Quote, "I felt as if stung by a serpent, as if scourged by a whip of scorpions, which drove me." These images of biting bugs involve literal penetration of the body, something that evokes a more literal physical sexual attack. Similarly, Matilda's reactions parallel that of Beatrice, who is literally raped by her father in Percy Shelley's The Genji. Both women's first reaction is to tear at their hair, for instance. Finally, Matilda may willingly remove herself from society, but the choice certainly recalls the more forced fate of standard fallen women after seduction, like the aforementioned Clarissa, for example. Through these parallels, Shelley legitimizes Matilda's trauma and underscores how a verbal enactment of sexual abuse can be as terrifying and traumatic as literal rape. Doing so not only legitimizes Matilda's experiences, it helps to establish a precedent that experiences that are not the most literal physical examples of sexual violence can still be legitimately traumatic. Such a precedent brings me to Shelley's second parallel, in which there are subtle connections between Diana's experiences and Matilda's, which, although twice removed, also help to equate Diana's life with that of a more literal rape survivor. Namely, Diana and Matilda's father's relationship appears, at worst, pseudo-incestuous and, at the very least, as based in an imbalance of power that will recall Matilda's later experiences. Shelley writes, having Matilda describe that early relationship, that, quote, she being Diana, and my father had been playmates from infancy. At 11 years of age, Diana was his favorite playmate, but he already talked the language of love. Michelle Faubert notes that the description here recalls that of Victor Frankenstein's early relationship with Elizabeth, his cousin turned wife. The language of playmates from infancy, though, makes their relationship seem all the more sibling-like and therefore pseudo-incestuous, much like the real kind of expression of incestuous desire we see later in the novel between the father and Matilda. Similarly, Diana, still being a playmate, someone largely invested in childlike activities, even as Matilda's father already speaks the language of love to her, suggests an imbalance in their relationship, one in which Matilda's father seems to have inaugurated the romantic side of their relationship without Diana even realizing. Later description in this same scene points to a similar phenomenon. Quote, the nature of her education made her more childish, at least in the knowledge and expression of feeling. She received his warm protestations with innocence and returned them unknowing of what they meant. What could she know of the difference between love and friendship? On the surface, Diana seems like a standard, uneducated, and perhaps unworldly woman of the 18th or 19th century. In spite of her lack of education, she gets her sort of happy ending in the form of a marriage, and underscoring the ubiquity of maternal death, her passing hardly registers for the reader or for Matilda. Diana's life is a stunningly ordinary one for a woman of her time, but the subtle parallels with Matilda's experience, which in turn parallel with the experience of a rape survivor, underscore that it need not be this way and that there's something inherently unjust about this. Like Matilda, Diana suffered and died due to a lack of alternative options, and a man, the same man, Matilda's father, exploiting that lack of options for himself. Diana's death may be a lot more quotidian, resulting from standard marriage and heterosexual reproduction, than Matilda's, but in the end, they're not so different. In turn, we can look at Matilda as an extended metaphor for the harmful ubiquity of these maternal deaths, for the way that everyday expectations of women entering a heterosexual union and producing children actually threatens women's lives and women's agency in a very literal way, and in turn is a legitimately traumatic experience. What might Shelley have to say about the women who do survive pregnancy, though? To get a richer idea of Shelley's thoughts on maternity, we must turn to her most long-lasting, major, and named maternal character, Idris from The Last Man. Idris's most salient quality is her ability to mother efficiently without demonstrating any kind of outward stress over maternal obligations. And a quote from Lionel describing her says, quote, while ceaseless anxiety for my welfare, Lionel's welfare, and the health of her children. However, she strove to curb or conceal it, absorbed all her thoughts. Even as Idris experiences this anxiety, Lionel notes that she is, quote, not rendered selfish, continuing to, quote, devote herself to the care of the sick and the helpless. Idris then epitomizes selflessness. Her worries over the loss of Lionel and her children are ceaseless, yet her priority is to hide Lionel from this worry. Repressing her own anxiety and later grief recalls what feminist thinkers often refer to as care work, that term which refers to when women's own needs are pushed aside in favor of caring for someone like a husband and children in a way that is unfulfilling and unrewarding. Such a concept goes beyond simple domestic tasks. It extends to having to push one's emotions to the side to, for instance, as Idris does, create a comforting space for Lionel, which he describes as, quote, if some scene of tremendous agony shook my frame and fevered my brow, I would lay my head on the lap of Idris and the tumultuous pulses subsided into a temperate flow. Until Idris's death, Lionel presents her care work and emotional regulation uncritically, but her actions become problematized at the moment of her death. Even when Idris is actively dying from exhaustion, she attempts to reassure Lionel that she's fine for his sake and their children's sake. And he says about her, quote, but she said she was better and I believed her, and she cheered my growing anxiety with gay sallies. Yet immediately following this moment, Idris collapses and dies. Various signs point to her death being hastened by exhaustion and nerves, including Lionel's ultimate self-awareness of what happens to his wife, about which he says, quote, I wonder now how I could be so blind and senseless as thus to risk the safety of Idris. For if I had eyes, surely I could see the sure, though deceitful, advance of death in her burning cheek and increasing weakness. But she said she was better, and I believed her. So once again, as in the case of the moment of incestuous desire in Matilda, Shelley uses a very extreme experience. In this case, it's attempting to survive in a brutal pandemic, which of course doesn't sound so extreme right now, but most of the time it does. This extreme experience encapsulates something a lot more quotidian for women, though. The imperative placed on mothers to suppress their stress and their emotions on behalf of taking care, doing care work, for their families and their male partners. Continuing in the tradition of Frankenstein as read by second-wave feminists, Shelley uses various examples of extreme circumstances, incestuous desire or a global pandemic, as a means by which to comment on the everyday ways mothers suffer and have their lives cut short. A more robust reading of Shelley's overall depiction of maternity in her works must start by, at the very least, attending to these different circumstances, which tend toward depicting actual mothers, as opposed to solely focusing on the potential metaphor at the heart of Frankenstein. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Kathleen. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to share your research with us and for really showing us how these anxieties around motherhood and pregnancy that we see so clearly in Frankenstein permeate Shelley's other works as well, looking at Matilda and The Last Man. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. So again, we're going to take questions at the end, please, but feel free to type them into the chat now if they come into your head. So I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Professor Michael Rossington. Michael, I can see you're on the screen. Michael Rossington is Professor of Romantic Literature at Newcastle University. He is joint general editor of the Longman Annotated English Poets series with Routledge, and editor of The Poems of Shelley, and editor of the Oxford World's Classics edition of Mary Shelley's Valperga, published with Oxford University Press in 2000. He has published widely on the Shelleys, including a chapter on Valperga and Mary Shelley and Her Times, the Johns Hopkins University Press 2000 edition, edited by Betty T. Bennett and Stuart Kern. And recently, he's published a chapter on Mary Shelley as editor, translator, and European in Antonella's brilliant Mary Shelley in Europe. Michael will be speaking on the Late Mary Shelley on Late Percy Shelley, focusing on the collected editions of Percy Shelley's poems, which Mary Shelley published in 1839, and examining her assessment of his poetic compositions of late 1821 and 1822. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for your very kind introduction. And I want to start by thanking Amanda and all her colleagues for organising this wonderful session, and to say that I feel very honoured to be invited to be part of it. I'm hugely enjoying the other panelists' contributions. I have a lot to live up to. When I first learned of the title of this event, I immediately thought about the period of Mary Shelley's life between the publication of the one-volume collected edition of the poetical works of Percy Bysshe Shelley in December 1839 and her death 170 years ago this month. I quickly realized how little I knew about her in the years between 1840 and 1851 and felt duly ashamed. They saw the publication in 1844, as Antonella has shown, of Rambles, one of my favorite of her publications. My focus now, however, is on her editing of Percy Shelley's poetry and her biographical work relating to him during her later life. These final 11 years are when her reputation as chief curator of Percy Shelley's poetry and writings are established definitively, and it seems appropriate to honour her achievement and to reflect on its consequences. In the postscript to the preface of the 4-volume collected poetical works added to the 1-volume edition and dated November 1839, Mary Shelley expressed a sense of closure. I now present this edition as a complete collection of my husband's poetical works, and I do not foresee that I can hereafter add to or take away a word or line. Charles Taylor established in 1958 that the authority of texts in the 4-volume 1839 edition was in many cases an unauthorized edition, explaining the reasons as follows, quote, "Jealous of her first editions and suffering from ill health, Mary Shelley chose a shortcut in the preparation of copy for the poetical works and was then unable to correct the proof to meet her own ideals of textual accuracy," unquote. William Michael Rossetti, in similar vein, had identified in the preface to his first 1870 edition of Percy Shelley's poetical works that Mrs. Shelley was one of 3 defendants, along with Shelley himself and Casualty, responsible for the poor state of the printed form of Percy Shelley's poems up to that date. Ill health, he wrote, and the pain of reminiscence curtailed her editorial labours, besides which, to judge from the result, he would say that Mrs. Shelley was not one of the persons to whom the gift of consistent accuracy has been imparted. I think he's being a little unkind there, actually. The pain of reminiscence is an allusion to the fact that Mary Shelley's notes in the 1839 editions, as Betty Bennett neatly puts it, kept to the letter of her agreement against biography with Sir Timothy, Percy Shelley's father, but just as surely violated its spirit. In these notes, Mary Shelley, in her words, endeavoured to narrate the origin and history of each poem and asserted her authority for doing so. I have the liveliest recollection of all that was done and said during the period of my knowing him. Her characteristic commitment to responsible testimony underpins the way in which she offers her collected edition as a tribute to her husband. Every impression, she writes, is as clear as if stamped yesterday, and I have no apprehension of any mistake in my statements as far as they go. I feel the importance of the task and regard it as my most sacred duty. But the cost of this task to her health is significant. A journal entry for the 12th of February 1839 records, "I almost think that my present occupation will end in a fit of illness. I am editing Shelley's poems and writing notes for them. I am torn to pieces by memory." That sense of strain is palpable, particularly in the notes on poems of 1821 and the notes on poems of 1822. At the beginning of the former, she writes, "I feel that I am incapable of putting on paper the history of those times." The sense of struggling to fulfill her remit in the face of painful recollection is visible, equally apparent to a modern reader of the limitations in her account of his poetic output in the final years of his life, or the final year rather of his life. Nora Crook has noted that Mary Shelley treats Percy Shelley's Charles I, the unfinished tragedy on which he expended much labour, relatively briefly, cursorily, in the 1839 edition. And of course, she was silent about his lyrics to Jane Williams. Before Mary Shelley's death, her publisher, Edward Moxon, published further editions of the collected poetical works in 1841, 1846, 1847, and 1850. My knowledge of them is woefully limited, confined to the 1847 three-volume edition, which omits 7 of the 9 cantos of Queen Mab. Mary Shelley's cautious explanation, "It is deemed advisable," she writes, "only to reprint the first 2 cantos," suggests an editorial decision governed by the trial in 1841 of Moxon, who was found guilty of blasphemous libel for publishing the complete Queen Mab in the 1-volume collected edition of 1839. This episode and its consequences demonstrate the impossibility of finality being lent to Mary Shelley's editorial labours, despite the closure that she sought. I'd like to know more about these late lifetime collected editions, their print runs, the differences between them, and their reach. For all the justified criticisms of her text by Rossetti and Swinburne in the 1860s, it was through Moxon's collected editions that Percy Shelley's poems and his life were read in the 11 years preceding her death. Just as Moxon's 1841 trial showed the poem's resistance to being fixed in the stable canon for which she longed, so too was she made aware in these late years of the unfinished business of writing the poet's life. Understandably taken aback by Thomas Medwin's projected biography to be published in 1847, she told him in a letter of May 1846, "As you remark, I had said, the time has not yet come to recount the events of my husband's life." This is an allusion to the opening paragraph of the preface to the first collected 1839 edition, where she states, "I abstain from any remark on any occurrences of his private life. This is not the time to relate the truth, and I should reject any colouring of the truth." Sir Timothy's injunction to be silent about his son's life had shaped what she could say about it in print, and of course, what poems could be published since the poet's death in 1822. Equally though, the intermittent and limited biography, which emerges through her notes to the collected editions, suited her sense that it was necessary to hold back on full disclosure, just as, of course, her collected editions of the poems, as she was well aware, were not complete. Something else I'd like to know more about is her conversations in the late 1840s with her son, Sir Percy Florence Shelley, and James St. John, who he married in 1848, about how the poet's archive should be managed, his life presented, reticences maintained, and the public held at bay while the 3 of them were alive. The sense of duty that drove her to present the public with Percy Shelley's poetry, for which we should all be lastingly thankful, was accompanied by the knowledge that the public would have to wait for some of the poetry he wrote and the life he lived. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much for that brilliant, wonderful talk. I mean, it's fascinating to hear from one of our greatest Shelley editors about the first Shelley editor, Mary Shelley herself. So thank you so much for that. And your talk spoke and complemented Antonella's in so many ways, I think, in this aspect of Mary Shelley as a mediator of Percy Shelley. So thank you so much for that. Again, please put your questions into the comment box and we'll come back to them later. Thank you again, Michael. So our next guest is Angela Wright. Angela, I think I saw you on the screen. Yes, you're there. Great. Angela Wright is Professor of Romantic Literature at the University of Sheffield. She is the author of numerous publications on Romantic women's writing and on Romanticism and the Gothic, including Britain, France, and the Gothic, 1764 to 1820, The Import of Terror, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, and her most recent monograph, Mary Shelley, published by University of Wales Press in 2018. She's the joint general editor of volumes 1 and 2 of the Cambridge History of the Gothic with Cambridge University Press from 2020 onwards with Dale Townsend, and has also co-edited Romantic Gothic, an Edinburgh Companion published in 2015, and Anne Radcliffe, Romanticism and the Gothic by Cambridge University Press in 2014, both with Dale Townsend. With Professor Michael Gamer, she is now working upon the first edition of the complete works of Anne Radcliffe for Cambridge University Press, where she will also be volume editor for Radcliffe's fourth romance, The Mysteries of Udolpho. Angela's monograph on Mary Shelley so critically speaks to this conversation we're having here this evening, examining, and I quote from Angela's book, the deep veins of connection between her different fictions, end quote, and revealing Mary Shelley's lifelong attraction to the Gothic. So Angela will be speaking to us today on the late Mary Shelley and the Gothic. Angela, welcome.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm just sharing my screen now. Can everyone see that? Everyone see the screen now? Is that okay? Yeah, great. Okay. So am I on slide 1 there? Yes. First of all, thank you to Amanda and the BAR's digital team for organising such a wonderful event. I've already learned so much from the previous speakers, and it's with some trepidation that I follow Michael Rossington, who has edited Valperga. But all the talks have been really brilliant so far. So when Amanda invited me to talk on Mary Shelley and the Gothic, I felt like a child in a sweet shop, because I didn't know what to choose from what I've thought about her. I've written chapters and essays on ghosts, and on The Last Man, and I really kind of was paralysed by anxiety about what I should speak about. So I thought I'd give you a little tour of some of the main ways in which I think that Mary Shelley engages with the Gothic beyond Frankenstein. And just for my title slide, I've put that quotation from The Last Man, when Lionel is wandering around Rome and, you know, the destruction in Rome, and he says, I remembered the dark monk and floating figures of the Italian, and how my boyish blood had thrilled at the description. And I think from that reference to boyish blood segues me into something that I think about Mary Shelley in relation to the Gothic, and that is that she read Gothic fiction at a fairly early age, and she read it at a time in her life when she was happy. So in slide 2, can everyone see slide 2? We see from the journal on Thursday the 22nd of September 1814, Claire Claremont observes that Mary reads the monk all evening while Shelley draws. And then we also have a note from Mary Shelley, read the Italian and talk all day, a very happy day indeed. And then she's a quick reader, far quicker than I am. The following day, there's the observation, finish the Italian. We don't really get an insight into how she views the Italian, but we do know that it persisted and stayed with her up until and beyond The Last Man. So it's remarkable that these Gothic novels that were published in the 1790s, Udolpho in 1794, Italian in 1796, and The Monk in 1796, are read at a considerable temporal distance from when they were published by Mary Shelley, and that she's thinking of them well beyond the original dates of their publication. And of course, you know, this is to do with her age and when she was reading and when they were available to her. But I still think it's remarkable that these novels persist at that time. So I have this trepidation about speaking about Mary Shelley and the Gothic, because On the one hand, I think that she's deeply immersed in the Gothic throughout her career, but I don't see her as someone who is necessarily scared of the Gothic. It doesn't really imbue her with terrors, but it's something that she engages with quite consistently. And that's why I'm anxious about speaking after Michael, who's edited Valperga. But I want to speak about one of the novels which is least associated with the Gothic in Mary Shelley, Valperga, and how she actually takes observations from the mysteries of Udolpho and the monk and actually freights them into Valperga in several key instances. One way is the way in which she compares Castruccio and her physical description of him to Montoni, Radcliffe's villain in the mysteries of Udolpho. And I've put two quotations there. I apologize about the denseness of the slide. But this is a quotation from the Mysteries of Udolpho, Emily St. Aubert's first impression of Montoni, the villain who imprisons her in the castle of Udolpho. And she's looking at him and she notes the quickness of his perceptions was strikingly expressed in his countenance. Yet that countenance could submit implicitly to the occasion, and more than once in this day the triumph of art over nature might have been discerned in it. And later down that quotation, Emily felt admiration, but not the admiration that leads to esteem, for it was mixed with a degree of fear. She knew not exactly wherefore. So we see that Radcliffe's heroine, who survives and who inherits her property, reads the face and actions of Montoni as a wily counsellor who listens to other people when it suits him and takes from that a degree of fear. And she's not sure why, but she has that. Now, if we compare that to Valperga and one of the first physical descriptions of Castruccio from the perspective of a heroine euthanasia, we note that his penetration into the dispositions of men was instantaneous, and he possessed also, as by instinct, the faculty of adapting himself to every character and of acquiring the love of all around him. And I think that if you read these two together, we almost think that actually Mary Shelley had the mysteries of Udolpho almost open in front of her, if you compare those two passages and think about how close they are. But there is one key distinction here, and that is that from the perspective of euthanasia, we see this, but at times a glance, a tone seemed to open a mine of undiscovered evil in his character that made her shudder in the very depths of her nature. Yet this sensation would pass away, and she, prompt to forget evil in others, thought no more of it. So we have both heroines' perspectives about these villainous characters, but it's really interesting when we think of euthanasia as being such an exceptional female author and reader, that she is the one who thinks no more of the clues that she's read in Castruccio's character, whereas Radcliffe's Emily St. Aubert reads Montoni and feels and takes away that degree of fear. Now, the monk was also really important to Mary Shelley in Valperga, and I want to suggest some ways here. As I put in the previous slide at the top, it's really interesting to think about the imbrication of Valperga with Frankenstein, that it was started in 1817 before Frankenstein was published, and then, finished some years later. But when we think about the other heroine in Valperga, Beatrice, there's also a clue that we gain from the Gothic novel The Monk by Matthew Lewis, which is one of those that Mary Shelley read in 1814 and 1815 again. And it's with the description of the heroine Antonian the monk, who dies a very brutal death. This is the first description of her that we see focalized from the perspective of another male, Lorenzo in The Monk. And we see that her features are hidden by a thick veil, but struggling through the crowd had deranged it sufficiently to discover a neck which for symmetry might have vied with the Medicean Venus. It was of a most dazzling whiteness and received additional charms from being shaded by the tresses of her long fair hair, which descended in ringlets to her waist. And again, part of me thinks that Mary Shelley had the monk in front of her as well when she was writing Valperga, because when we look at the first vision of Beatrice as she's seen for the first time by Castruccio, it's really interesting to think about the way the hood is thrown back by the older woman beside her, and the deep black eyes, half concealed by their heavy lids, curved lips, and face formed in a perfect oval, the rising colour that glowed in her cheeks, which, through her complexion, was pure and delicate, were tinged by the suns of Italy. But this formed a picture such as Guido has since imagined, and that's my emphasis there, when he painted a Virgin or an Ariadne, or which he copied from the life when he painted the unfortunate Beatrice Cenci. Her jet hair fell in waving luxuriance on her neck and her shoulders below her waist. So you see the tresses of hair falling below the waist in the description of both characters. It's very striking, the consonances there, and the way in which both authors kind of compare their heroines to forms of art, sculpture in one case. But I think that what's interesting with Valperga and that description of Beatrice is that bit that I emphasize, the pictures such as Guido has since imagined when he painted a Virgin or an Ariadne. It's as if, you know, for Mary Shelley, there is no original to her Beatrice. She has been thought up, and although she's compared to Matthew Lewis as a monk, it's as if artists cannot capture her form. That has to come afterwards, if that makes sense. So, I mean, beyond noticing these textual comparisons, I guess that one of the questions that I might like to ask is, why are these important and why do these matter? Because Valperga is a historical novel. Well, one of the insights that stayed with me critically as I've been thinking about Valperga in relation to the Gothic is Sonia Hofkosch's insight that Valperga offers a consideration of how the representation of history transforms into a study of the history of representation. And that for me is an insight that has remained with me since I've begun to think about Valperga. It's really useful to me. And to extend Hofkosch's excellent insight there, I would argue that Valperga and Mary Shelley's other later fiction is often about the history of emulation when it comes to the Gothic. And I'll explain a little bit more about that because it gives us an insight into why those descriptions in Valperga of Castruccio and Beatrice matter in relation to the Gothic. So to do so, I'm going to look back to Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother, and what she said in her advertisement to her novella Mary. In the advertisement to Mary, Wollstonecraft stated, "In delineating the heroine of this fiction, the author attempts to develop a character different from those generally portrayed. Those chosen few wish to speak for themselves and not to be an echo even of the sweetest sounds." So Mary Wollstonecraft in the advertisement to Mary said that there was no original for her character. She wanted to distance herself from Clarissa Harlowe and Sophie Rousseau's character, and she wanted to kind of think about a brand new type of heroine. And this is something that she does as well in The Wrongs of Woman or Maria, where at the opening she self-consciously distances herself from the Gothic, saying, "I'm not going into that. You know, this is not about abodes of horror and castles covered with ivy." So we know that Mary Shelley pored over her mother's works, and what's important about that and about what she takes from it. Well, what I get from it is that she didn't quite agree with her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, about not having an original, not having literary echoes in her own characters. And we see that very forcefully in Valperga. I think that Valperga very self-consciously and intertextually engages with the Gothic. The clues are there if you can see them. And it's very reflexive in the way in which it engages with that, because it focuses upon the constitution of character in the Gothic mode, and it emulates Lewis's and Radcliffe's heroines. So how do we read the signs of villainy and evil? How do we figure a way to move beyond the burden of the figuration of a heroine as a work of art? Now, for me, one possible response to that may come in what Mary Shelley does slightly differently, in the way that she awards her heroines and those heroines who are victims an unfolding of a tale, and also the decision to withhold tales of horror. Shelley's protagonists, in contrast to Emily and the Mysteries of Udolpho and Antonia and the Monk, decide the terms of a revelation of their tales. Now, I think that I'm more or less out of time, so I cannot go over this slide in detail, and I've packed quite a bit into it. But of course, when we're thinking about unfolding or editing tales of horror, we immediately think about the ghost's warning to Hamlet in Act 1, Scene 5, "I could a tale unfold," a speech that was refigured by Anne Radcliffe in the epigraph to her second novel, A Sicilian Romance, and in chapter 2 of The Mysteries of Udolpho. And I think that when we think about Valperga and the tale of Beatrice, who is sexually assaulted and discarded by Castruccio, well, that tale can seem relentlessly grim and pessimistic about the fate of exceptional women, but we should not see Beatrice as a sort of cardboard Gothic cutout, because it's redeemed by the way in which she will only offer an edited version of her misfortunes to euthanasia, refusing to tell that which would chill your warm blood with horror. Beatrice refuses to terrify euthanasia about the details and extent of the horrors that have befallen her. And I think that's what's different in what Mary Shelley does to the examples of Antonia and Emily in the Mysteries of Udolpho. It's that sense of withholding tales, something, as I've put in the final slide, that we also see in The Last Man, where Lionel says, "This tale therefore shall be rapidly unfolded in The Last Man," and refuses and withholds the horrors that he witnesses in France. So Mary Shelley engaged with the Gothic throughout her career and also beyond The Last Man in her short tales. But I think that what she does is that she energizes the Gothic, she emulates it, yes, and she actually almost uses it very intertextually by imitating it and taking key passages from novels, but she takes it in a radically different direction in the way that she edits and withholds key tales that her protagonists tell. So I'll end there because I think I've gone over my time, and I do apologize about that. Sorry, Amanda.
Thank you so much for that, Angela. A round of applause for you all around. That was just fascinating, and it speaks so well to Michael's talk. I mean, I'm looking forward to the discussion after this, but thinking about Mary Shelley bringing on these Gothic heroines and editing them, withholding information. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I especially loved this emotive response that Mary Shelley has that you spoke upon, that you faced with some trepidation, that she's not terrified by the Gothic. She finds so much happiness in the Gothic. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very happy by your talk. Thanks. Okay, moving on. We have our last but not least speaker now, Carly. Carly, are you on the screen? Yep, I can see you there. Great. So Carly Yingst is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Harvard University with research interests in 18th century and Romantic literature. Her dissertation, Unsettling Time in the British Novel, 1720 to 1830, reconsiders the early novel's relation to changing conceptions of time in modernity, with a concluding chapter on Mary Shelley's writings in the 1820s, including The Last Man and Valperga, as well as Shelley's journals and letters. Carly is a former communications fellow for the Keats-Shelley Association of America and a coordinator of the Long 18th Century and Romanticism Colloquium at Harvard. Carly will be discussing Mary Shelley's futures, considering the different ways Shelley imagines the future in the face of catastrophic events, both personal and historical. Drawing on The Last Man, Valperga, and Shelley's contemporaneous Journal of Sorrow, Carly will argue that the distinct approaches to time that emerge in these writings reveal Shelley's resistance to and reworking of increasingly dominant romantic modes of thinking about the future. Carly, welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction, Amanda. And thank you, just to echo what everybody else has said about the invitation to this event. It's been really great. I have great trepidation about being the one to close, as well to speak on Valperga following Michael. But thank you for this opportunity. Okay, let me share my screen quickly. Twice in 1823, Mary Shelley claims as her motto a phrase she had first encountered in Pisa several years earlier. And that phrase is alla giornata. Here it is in Pisa. This phrase can be translated literally from Italian as day by day, but Shelley took the phrase to mean something slightly more specific and peculiar. My motto must now be alla giornata, she writes in her journal in March of that year. Each day must be in itself complete, depending neither with hope or fear upon the future. Thus, I may make something of my time. In a letter written several months later, she further develops the strange temporality at work in her initial explanation. At present, she writes, I will not look beyond the present hour. I am here, so I am, where I shall be, will know. And my motto being alla giornata, I shut my eyes and will not care. In taking this phrase as my starting point today, what I want to focus on is the way that Shelley uses this so-called motto to rethink the relation between present and future. In a curious move, the logic of Shelley's explanation first severs the present from the future. It makes each day in itself complete by refusing not only fear, but also, I think, more troublingly, hope and care for the future as well. But that refusal itself then allows access to the future. Making each day in itself complete allows one to make something of one's time, to find, more obscurely, the shall be in the I am. Perhaps the easiest way to understand this strange logic is to read it in relation to the particular crises ongoing at the time Shelley adopts. The motto, as an attempt to close off the present, appears specifically here as a strategy for managing both her ongoing grief following Percy's death and her intense anxieties arising from her impending departure from Italy. To seal herself off in the present is thus to insulate herself from the overwhelming nature of such grief and anxiety, thereby allowing her to think or do something, anything, other than dwell with that grief and anxiety. As an aside here, I will say that I've been trying hard to adopt this motto as my own motto over the past 11 or so months, although I started writing about it a couple years before that. I failed, I think Mary Shelley herself fails, but it's a project that's interesting nonetheless. Moving beyond this immediate response to catastrophe, though, I want to spend the rest of my time today by considering how the logic contained in this motto reflects a broader dissatisfaction in Shelley's thinking with certain ways of imagining the future that had become dominant in the Romantic period. And I want to think of it as sketching to an alternative way of approaching what is to come. To understand the dissatisfaction that prompts that alternative, it might be helpful first to turn to the past, to Valperga, to Shelley's first historical novel, although as Michael Rossington has shown, the novel sits somewhat uneasily in that label, in part because of the way in which it, quote, traces the dynamic and constantly shifting relationship between temporal realms. One key element in that constantly shifting account of temporal relations involves euthanasia's eventual total erasure from the historical record. Even her name perished, we learn at the novel's conclusion. Men forgot her. More striking still, at least for my purposes, is the fact that on the eve of Castruccio's invasion of Valperga, euthanasia herself anticipates that future erasure in a deservedly oft-quoted passage. We look back to times past and we mass them together. Euthanasia reflects in this moment and say in such a year, such and such events took place, such wars occupied that year, and during the next there was peace. Yet each year was then divided into weeks, days, minutes, and slow-moving seconds as now. The present moment will soon be only a memory. 100 years hence, and I shall no longer feel the coil that is at work in my heart. I know this, but yet this moment is all to me. Now, the particular way that euthanasia moves here between temporal perspectives follows in part the logic of what recent critics have called thinking in the tense of the future anterior or the future perfect, which projects forward to an imagined future in order to look retrospectively backward at the present. As those critics have also shown, this way of imagining the future had become increasingly common in Romantic thinking, emerging in part as a response to growing uncertainties about the future in the wake of the French Revolution. For Jonathan Sacks, for one example of this way of thinking serves for many as, quote, the best response to anxieties about futurity, because it can imagine the completion of a narrative whose ending is not yet known in the present. To imagine that future, Sacks goes on, could even be a comfort. For euthanasia, though, that anticipation of the future's backward glance seems rather less comforting. Like Shelley herself, who later imagines that her writing will become as future waste paper. The future that euthanasia projects is one in which she sees herself become nothing at all. In her refusal of that anticipated erasure in favor of this moment as all, then, I think we can hear an echo of Shelley's Alla Giornata. And through that echo, we can begin to better understand part of what that motto might be refusing when it looks not beyond the present hour, namely an anticipation of the future that brings with it an awareness of the coming obliteration of the present. If Valperga examines this anticipation of the future primarily from the perspective of the past, The Last Man then might in turn be seen as approaching the same problem from the perspective of the future itself. Set in the 21st century, the novel, of course, as we know, tells an apocalyptic story of plague that wipes out the human race, finally leaving Lionel Verney as the eponymous last man. As with Valperga, though, the temporality of this novel is quite complicated in this case by its editorial preface, which presents the apocalyptic tale as being recovered from fragments, apparently centuries old, found sealed in the Sibyl's cave, fragments of which are then edited sometime in the 1820s. To complicate things still further, readers of the novel have long understood Shelley herself to be reflected both in the present's editorial figure and in Verney, the future's last man. She's reflected in the editor in part because the narrative's recovery aligns with the events of her life, and she's reflected in Verney because of her famous imagination of herself in her journal as being that last man. With the parallel to Verney in mind, many have thus thought of The Last Man's apocalyptic tale as a kind of projection of personal crisis into a universal catastrophe. And along similar lines, I think we can understand that narrative too as a projection of present crisis into a future catastrophe. But by embedding that projection within the editorial frame set in the present, Shelley also allows us to question that future projection of the world's end. Deeply self-conscious about the ways that the reconstruction distorts the recovered fragments, the editor ultimately suggests that what follows is shaped as much by their, quote, own peculiar mind and talent as by Verney, ultimately claiming that the narrative is less a transcription of the fragments and more as an adaptation and translation of them. By drawing attention to that work of translation or adaptation, then, the novel itself makes its readers aware of the structures of projection by which its catastrophic future is imagined as a reflection of the private and present into the universal and future. Where the anticipation of the future in Valperga shows how the future threatens to erase the present, then the imagination of the future in The Last Man might be seen to reveal a similar threat that the present can pose to the future, as the future on this reading comes to seem like little more than a magnification of the present's particular anxieties. It's through its refusal to project or anticipate the future in this or any way, then, that the logic of that motto, alla giornata, sketches an alternative to that threat. Sealing the present off from the future and the future from the present, that motto works not to make the future known, but rather to confront the future in its unknowability. Thus, perhaps, it opens a space for the future to appear as something other than just a continuation of the present as we know it. It appears as something other than that which we in the present fear or even hope it to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly, so much for that incredibly insightful talk. I mean, it's considered not just Shelley, but romanticism and futurity more broadly. It's given me so much to think about. Thank you so much for that. And I love how you've also given us this motto through Mary Shelley of alla giornata, which I think we'll all take on from this evening onwards. So thank you for that. And you've brought us full circle, really, in thinking about this Italianized, self-Italianized Mary Shelley as well that we saw in Antonella. So I realize that we're quite short on time, so I'm going to jump straight into questions now. We've got quite a number of questions coming through in the chat. So first, I'm going to pick from these questions that all of our panelists could address together, and then I'll move on to specific questions for each presenter, if that's okay. So is Hadas Elber Avrion still here with us?
Hi, yeah.
Yes, hi. Could you ask your question, please?
Oh, it's way back in the chat. Do you want to do that?
Oh, okay. Okay, I'll read it out for you, but you can stay on the screen, please. That would be great.
Sure.
So Hadas has asked, was Mary Shelley also particularly a mediator between cities? I'm thinking particularly of London and Rome in The Last Man. So if any of our panelists would like to address that, Mary Shelley as a mediator between cities.
I can say something, although, you know, I'm not the most qualified, but just as a reaction. I think it's an interesting question. I never thought about cities so much because I was more in the frame of mind of thinking of civilizations, histories. But indeed, I think cities are part of this broader picture. And I think that's what I found when I was mentioning this idea of translation as a cultural transfer. So I really think that she had this broader picture that comes out both in the Anglo-Italian, but in general, you know, the hyphenated vision. And I'm thinking also, but perhaps Mike would have more ideas on this, on her perception of the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars when she was traveling around Europe. And that is one aspect. And another aspect that I could see, again, Mike talked about this, about always bringing back the classical civilization when she talks about Rome and the modern one. So I see that, but you know, perhaps there's another aspect of cities as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
It's a really interesting question, Hadas. Just very quickly, in terms of what Antonella just said and about the travel writing, that's what I thought of. Rambles, her journals, lots of kind of perceptions about, reminds me quite a lot of Wollstonecraft actually as well, that kind of cultural commentary. And I mean, Antonella's work in this area on that kind of comparative cultural thinking, I think is really helpful. But it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Could I also say something? I think that it's a great question as well. And if you also look at her later novels, you know, none of us have spoken about Lodore or Faulkner, for example, but in Lador, there's a question of two nations, you know, with the daughter Ethel taken off to America and then brought back to London. And then Faulkner alternates between England and Italy as well. So there's this sense of constant movement and moving around between nations in those novels, and, you know, visiting cities as well. That's quite important. So have a look at the later ones as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We have a question from Anna Mercer, a really great one about Mary Shelley's literary identity that I think all of our panelists could speak to.
Hi, thanks, Amanda. Wow, what a wonderful panel. I really enjoyed that. I need to go back and watch it again to really kind of get into the nuances of it. It was brilliant. So many questions, but what I really did want to ask the panel, which I thought might apply to all of you, is there's been a lot of talk from all your presentations about Mary Shelley's literary identity. So thinking about her as an editor, as influenced by her travels in Italy, her considerations of Mary Shelley as a mother, the Gothic, and then her journals as well at the end. But I wonder to what extent the panelists think Mary Shelley's literary identity is linked to the prose form. How important is prose as a genre to Mary Shelley? Have any of you looked at Mary Shelley's verse? I'm really interested in this because I'm looking at a manuscript notebook used by Mary Shelley at the moment, where she writes, "Alas, I cannot write poetry." And that was in 1814, so right at the start of her career. So I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on Mary Shelley and prose.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for a great question. Yes, I suppose I do, because I did have a look at some of her poetry in the Pforzheimer collection that was in manuscript form there, and had a think about it specifically in relation to The Last Man and Mourning and Elegy. But to me, I guess I do configure most of her identity in relation to prose, and the short stories that she reads, as well as the longer novels, is something that is really important and becomes increasingly important, as Antonella's paper also said about the essays as well. So the way in which she kind of moves from longer novels to short stories as she's writing for magazines, I think is really important. And I do see, in relation to the essays as well, a great conversation that she has in relation to what she's doing in her fiction. You know, for example, Giovanni Villani, you know, she talks about the author having to remove her own identity. And that, it seems to me to be very instrumental to what she's doing in her fiction. You know, with the kind of removal of the self and the relegation of the female editor. And Carly was mentioning about, you know, the way in which euthanasia is obliterated at the end of Valperga. So yes, to be honest, I don't have enough of her poetry to go on, but I do think it's important, specifically in relation to her mourning. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I was just going to add very quickly, it's a brilliant question, Anna, thank you. And actually, one of the things that came into my mind as you were speaking, Anna, and also from what Angela's just said, is the versatility and that sense. I'm kind of thinking across her oeuvre, if you like, at the letters and the journals, as well as the novels and the short stories that Angela's just mentioned, and you know, the attentiveness to conversation. I thought that Antonella's slide earlier on about her admiration for the familiar essay, for the Elia essays, was you know, wonderful. And yeah, just also I think it was cultural as well. I mean, that's coming through very strongly, I think, in this session. You know, that kind of awareness of languages, the plurality of languages, and of dialogue across cultures. So it's not a very good answer to your question, Anna, but it's a really, thank you for asking it.
I don't want to add because these were excellent points. I just wanted to say that when I was preparing this talk, and as well, I was struggling to fit into the 10 minutes and trying to say something sort of meaningful. But it was a very good exploration when I decided to focus on the essays. And as I told you, because I've been working on this minor reviewer, Mary Margaret Baskin, I was trying to say, how is Mary Shelley as a writer of essays? And well, at least the first essay are just so brilliant, you know, so beautifully written. It really stands out by comparison with the other women writers I wrote, in the sense that she does respect the genre, but one can see that something comes over from the novelist into the essay writer. And I need to read more about it. But I also got a feeling by reading the other essays about Italian subjects that there is a lot of flexibility and interest in different genres. So as she moves on, one almost feels that a new kind of way of writing adds up, you know. And the last reviews, there's still some uncertainties, but if we accept the last reviews that have been kind of recognized as hers, I have a feeling that there she's more kind of professional, using a fixed style in which she summarizes the text that she has to present. While the first are more, you know, in the style of the essay, of the conversational essay.
Thank you so much for that. I don't know if Carly or Kathleen, if you'd like to respond to that question as well.
Yeah, just a really quick footnote to say that I've been thinking a lot about all of the different ways in which, in that editor's preface of The Last Man, the editor talks about sort of distorting or changing. I mean, she'll move between, or they'll move between, sort of describing it as a transcription and describing it as a translation. But one of the things that the editor specifically says, I've often wondered at the subject of her verses, of the Cumaean Sibyl's verses, and that's one of the ways in which this seems to be distorted, but is that it moves from verse to prose. That there's something that Shelley, or this editor or Shelley herself, can't quite capture in that form. And it seems, again, interesting that she presents it specifically, again, as a kind of distortion, something that she does seem to have a kind of anxiety about. Their pristine condition, they've sort of fallen from where they were. I don't know if I have too much more to add to that, but it's something that I've been trying to figure out, especially in relation to her journals, which, I mean, are of course in prose, but sometimes as she starts breaking things up with dashes, it does start to fall into a kind of strange poetic cadence. So yeah, a lot to think about. Thanks.
Yeah, and I would just, I mean, I was thinking, so I'm not actually super familiar with her verse. Just thinking about Matilda's the text I'm the most familiar with, and just thinking about that kind of similar to what like Carly's mentioning with the intro to The Last Man. I mean, Matilda is, I wish I had a more specific word than weird. I mean, in some ways it's drawing so heavily from things that were drama like the Cenci, or in verse like Dante and things like that. It's kind of reinterpreting those in some ways, but it's not, you know, I called it a novel in my talk. I mean, I don't know that I think of Matilda as a novel necessarily, not only because it's so, you know, it's so short, of course, but it's missing so many of the kind of like conditions or tropes of a novel. Like so much of it just kind of gets erased. Like we don't know anything really about how she manages to like fake her own death. Like all of these kind of plot points are not really fleshed out and not clarified. It's a very strange way to write prose. And I don't know that I mean, I don't know that I'd call it like poetry like or verse like. I mean, I think some of the language, specifically kind of towards the end when she's describing like the planned suicide and things, like recall a lot of verse, but it's definitely like, I call it like non-standard prose at the very least, or kind of like an atypical way to do a novel.
Oh, thank you for so many interesting responses there, because I think that just encapsulates Mary Shelley's incredible range as an author, basically. So thanks.
Thanks, Anna. I'm really conscious of the time, but we've got so many questions in the chat, but there's one that I think all of our speakers could speak to from Lisa Vargo. If Lisa, you're still with us. Yeah, great.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, I'm having some computer problems this week. And greetings to everyone. And thank you for your papers. The question that, first of all, with respect to that wonderful phrase, alla giornata, I couldn't help but think of Percy Shelley's "Today is for itself enough" and "To Jane the Invitation." Though that does, I suppose, play a little bit into withholding. And my question was just to draw on that, which has already been raised, about how much of Mary Shelley's writings and thoughts are related to that issue of withholding. And I think it's been used against her, particularly the late Mary Shelley, as seen as a failure. That passage from the journals where she's reflecting on Chartism and so forth, and says, "I'm not a person of opinions." And this is held against her. And I guess I would just ask anyone to reflect a little bit more on how one might view withholding as a strength in what she is trying to achieve in her writings. So thank you very much, and thank you for letting me ask this question.
Lisa, that's a wonderful question. And sorry, I hope it's okay, because I just immediately, as you were talking, and having listened to everybody else this evening, I was thinking about exactly the same thing a few minutes ago. And that sense of that actually, I think this is partly to do with integrity and a quality of honesty and incredible awareness on her part. Angela spoke brilliantly about reflexiveness and self-awareness in her wonderful paper. And that sense that actually, in relation, as you say, Lisa, she gets, in many ways, she has been and continues to be in some quarters quite harshly treated for things she does not say, but actually there's that awareness that not everything can be said. I mean, I think that comes across in the perceptions, the insights we've heard this evening about the novels, the brilliant insights of Carly and Kathleen, and in a sense, as I say, I feel it's a mark of her, both her, I'm using that word integrity, but that sense of truthfulness. I mean, she is very, very strongly driven by a sense of responsibility, by an ethical commitment. And with that maybe does come an awareness that there are things which, both can't be known and can't be said.
Could I say something as well? Yeah, I don't know if it's, well, I'm kind of thinking my feet. I've been teaching all afternoon as well, so I may be slightly incoherent by now. And if I am, please forgive me. But I was thinking about a letter that she wrote to Edward Trelawney in relation to Faulkner, her final novel, where she noted to him something that she perceived as a shortcoming in her own work. She said, "I cannot teach." She said, "I can only paint." And I think that, her kind of grasping for that artistic metaphor is really interesting. That she always seems to shy away from didacticism by trying to instruct her readership how to react to certain things. And that can be seen, Lisa, I guess, as withholding. I don't know if that relates to what you're thinking about.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Yes, I just thank you both for this beautiful insight, and Lisa as well for this answer. When I was looking at the genre of the essay, I found quite a few references to the idea of the quality of tact that is mentioned often for Lamb, and I thought that that can be applied as well to her. That when she mentions something, there is also tact.
Thank you for those responses. Kathleen and Carly, would you like to input anything just before we end here? I'm very conscious of the time and don't want to keep people.
I mean, I was just thinking a little bit about, this is not so much about Shelley herself, but I mean, I think there's a parallel. I mean, both the kind of or all three of the women characters. I talk about Matilda, Diana by virtue of just being kind of textually absent, and then Idris I mean, they're all kind of withholding themselves in a way, like I was kind of saying, Matilda, I mean, Idris is the most straightforward example actually, because she's, Shelley makes it known that she's feeling these things. And even the fact that she's feeling them to an extent that like Lionel can notice, but they're never, like, she never expresses them directly. It's never kind of expressed in such a way that the reader can really kind of like learn about like this effect of stress and this effect of trauma. And same with, I mean, with Matilda, it's even more withholding. We can look into it and kind of find the ways this absence of a mother has impacted her life. But she's so, I mean, it's like I said in my talk, Matilda never mentions it. It's like, oh, my mother's dead, she's gone, I'm never going to talk about it again, which is interesting because so is her father until he returns. But she talks about him all the time, like something about the dead mother, she feels like there's just nothing to express, there's nothing to be said about. So that's kind of a moment of like withholding within the texts themselves.
Yeah, and just quickly, I don't know if this is about withholding itself, but sort of picking up on what Michael was saying about the way that Shelley tries to speak truly about things that cannot be spoken of, and the sort of difference between sort of teaching and painting. I mean, one of the tricks and the problems that I keep running into as I'm working, this is part of a longer chapter and part of a larger project, is that Shelley never really straightforwardly articulates this idea. I mean, one, it's an idea, the sort of alla giornata idea that breaks grammar. There's that weird moment, like she says, so I am where I shall be, shall will know, which just doesn't make any sense at all. Like, it seems to be something that's so far exceeding grammar that it can't really be said. And then it can only be in the kind of like gaps and spaces between these different projects that she works this out. It's sort of between The Last Man and her journals that she's trying to figure it out. It's interesting. I think this goes back to something Angela was saying about the way that that Verney eventually turns away from sort of recording all of the detail. And he specifically says there that I am not going to give you a journal. If you want that, go read Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. He keeps refusing exactly that form that Shelley is using on the other side, right? She's writing her Journal of Sorrow as a way of recording her own experience as the last man, as she says, but then her last man refuses that form. And it seems to be only by sort of mapping these different ways and using these different genres that she's able to kind of get at this sort of strange thing. So it's not, again, quite about withholding, but about the way in which so much of her work seems to be about painting, if not teaching. Like, it can't really be narrated. It has to be kind of formalized, these different ways of trying to think about what can't be said.
I think these are wonderful, helpful answers, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for these responses to our audience, and also to the ways in which your responses speak so well to each other. I'm very conscious of the time, so we're going to end here. I realize there are many questions we haven't gotten to, but I will hand these over to our speakers afterwards, and perhaps they could chase them up by email or on social media if that would be okay. And apologies for this again. But please do join me in giving a huge round of applause to all of our speakers for this brilliant session, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Thank you so much. So we'll hang around, the bar's digital events teams and myself will hang around for a bit longer. If anyone wants to come on the video, turn on their audio and have a bit of a chat. But if you have to dash, of course, we understand, and it was lovely to see everyone. And thank you once again to our fantastic speakers. Thank you so much.